The Swiss Family Robinson, Chapter 25, A Shoal of Herrings. Nothing was now talked of but the new house, how it should be arranged, and how fitted up. As the inner portion of the rock, which had been pierced before, reaching our magnificent grotto, was soft, and since I anticipated it would be hardened rapidly on exposure to the air, I resolved to at once make such cuttings as were necessary. Openings were therefore first hewn out of the rock for admitting light and air, and doors and windows had been brought from the wreck, were transferred from the falcon's nest and fixed in position. The immense space was then divided into several apartments. At the right of the entrance were to be our dwelling and sleeping rooms, and at the left our kitchen, workshop, and stables. The smaller division which was so deep in the cave with no windows could be made in it. I determined to use as cellar, storehouses, and magazines. I hoped by degrees to supply the necessary doors as well as our additions needful for the comfortable dwelling house. And though our work went slowly on, we labored with cheerful goodwill to effect the necessary arrangements for adapting it to our use, and did not doubt that it would be sufficiently advanced to enable us to take up our abode in it before winter set in. Our residence at Tent House, in consequence of our employment, revealed several advantages which we had not foreseen. Turtles frequently came ashore to deposit their eggs in the sand, and from their flesh we had made many of sumptuous meals. When more than one appeared at a time, we used to cut off their retreat of the sea by dexterously turning them on their backs, and then fastening them to a stake driven close to the water's edge by a cord, passed through the hole in the shell. Thus, we had fresh turtle always within reach, for they throve well, and were in as good condition after several weeks as other freshly caught. But this is not at all. A fresh surprise awaited us. As the approach of the tent house one morning, we were attracted by a most singular phenomenon. The waters out at the sea were curiously agitated, and as they heaved and boiled, struck by the beams of the morning sun, they seemed illuminated by flashes of fire. Over the water, where this disturbance was taking place, hovered hundreds of birds, screaming loudly and ever and anon darting downward and plunging beneath the water. Suddenly this extraordinary mass advanced to the bay, and we found the unusual appearance to be caused by a shoal of herrings, many leagues in extent and several feet deep. So a huge group of herring fish. We call it a school, but back then it was a shoal. We lost no time in putting in for a share of the spoil, and soon our fishery was in full operation. Fritz and Jack stood in the water with baskets and bailing out the fish threw them in the sand. My wife and Ernest dressed and rubbed them with salt, and I arranged them in small barrels, a layer of herring and one of salt alternately. This occupied us several days, at the end of which time a dozen or more barrels of excellent salted provisions were secured against the winter's need. A still large quantity was slid up and hung on lines under the roof of a small hut of reeds. A fire of green moss and bushwood was then lighted under them, which threw out a dense smoke. This smoke effectively preserved or cured the fish, imparting them at the same time a very pleasant flavor. I also found an empty sailor's chest on the shore, in the sides of which I bored holes, and putting into a heavy stones, sank it among the rocks. Here it formed a pot for crabs and lobsters, which were drawn by the attractive bait of the refuse of the herrings. And by this contrivance we obtained a constant supply, the chest being secured by a chain. Fearing that a change in the weather might come upon us before we expected it, we resumed the work of fitting our rock castle. I found on closer inspection that the crystallized salt in the cavern had for its base a species of gypsum. Breaking off several pieces and carrying them to Tent House, I heated them with red hot heated them red hot in the fire, and then reduced them to the powder. This we mixed with water, made a beautiful white plaster, which was afterwards a great use to us. Fortunately, in this beautiful climate, little or no attention was necessary for the kitchen garden. The seeds sprang up and flourished with apparently not the slightest regard for time or for the season of the year. We had always a succession of delicious fruits and vegetables, peas, beans, wheat, barley, rye, and maize. Seemed to be constantly ripening, while cucumbers, melons, pineapples, and all sorts of other vegetables grew luxuriantly. The moisture caused by the heavy rains had no doubt helped to produce this result. I therefore was encouraged to hope that the experiments of Falcon's Nest had proved equally successful, and we started one morning to visit the spot. On our way, we passed the large field in which my wife had sown the European grain after the potatoes had taken from the ground. In one part was barley, in another was wheat, and further on we saw rye, peas, millet, and field beans, and in great profusion and luxuriance, all for the most part nearly ready for cutting. The harvest has begun already, has it not? I asked. An immense flock of birds rose in the air, startled by the dogs and alarmed by their approach. Fritz released his eagle, which he always carried, hooded and perched on his game bag. The bird had by this time become very tractable, and when Fritz uncovered his eyes and threw it aloft after one of the fugitives, it seemed to scare the whole flock. Singling out a large quail, the eagle pounced upon it, frightened quarry, and would have made end of its life in the moment had it not Fritz been close at hand to release it from its bird's talons. The greater part of this day was spent in securing seed grain for another year's sowing, and in making preparations for a little excursion which we had been proposed for the following day.